This is the complete history of Linux, abridged. I should preface everything by saying that the original slide deck for this was over 200 slides. I kind of went nuts. I wrote this over the course of about a year, and then I realized there was no possible way on this green earth I could possibly present this to people in any reasonable amount of time, so I began chopping things until I got it to less than 60, thinking I'd take 60 seconds or less per slide. I do not even know if that will be possible. So that's where we're at right now. We have 54 slides. This is not everything. This is very much abridged. These are the parts of the history of Linux that I found the most amusing or interesting, or that I thought people might not know. So we're just going to dive into it. Yes, I'm going to miss some of your favorite bits. We're going to start back in 1964. I did originally, my first slide was a picture of a monolith with monkeys hitting it with bones. I deleted that one because it took too much time, and now I'm talking about it, which defeated the purpose of deleting it. Back in 1964, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology got together with General Electric and Bell Labs. A lot of people don't remember that General Electric, that GE was involved with this, but GE was very big in the computer space back in the 60s, actually. And they created a system called Multics. Anyone ever used Multics? No, of course you haven't. Multics stands for Multiplexed Information and Computing Service. It was sort of the predecessor to Unix in a lot of ways. It was developed in part by two guys named Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. This is them right there. This is those two handsome, lovely gentlemen. This is from a little bit later. This is from a later PDP machine, but those are the two guys responsible for Multics. Multics was a very weird machine, and this is Ken Thompson talking about it. He says it was an over-designed and overbuilt and over-everything. It was close to unusable. They, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, still claim it was a monstrous success, but it just clearly wasn't. I love Ken Thompson. He speaks his mind, and I get that. But then a little bit later, in 1969, some stuff was happening. Well, and part of it was the Digital Equipment Corporation's PDP-7, which is this machine right there. Look at this. That's what a computer is supposed to look like, by the way. That is pure sexy. I mean, seriously, if you could buy a computer that looked like that, wouldn't you? Don't you want your entire living room to look like that? I mean, I kind of do. I mean, sure, I want a little bit better of a monitor on it, but otherwise, it's perfect. So Ken Thompson, one of the guys behind Multics, created a video game on Multics called Space Travel. And Space Travel was super, super cool and super complex for the day. It included gravitational simulations. It wasn't really a game. It was more of a sandbox environment where you're in a simple spaceship and you fly around the solar system, and like different planets have gravity that pull you a little bit, and that's all you do. That's the whole darn thing. The problem was, on the machines that were available at the time, there were some issues with that. And Dennis Ritchie, who you might also remember as one of the... What the heck is going on? I'm hearing Daleks in the room. Dennis Ritchie had this to say. He and I, Ken Thompson, rewrote Space Travel to run on this machine, the PDP-7. The undertaking was more ambitious than it might seem because we disdained all existing software, right? That's how you know they're real computer people. They hate all software that exists. It was more ambitious than it might seem. We had to write a floating point arithmetic package, the point-wise specification of the graphic characters for the display, and a debugging system that continuously displayed the contents of typed-in locations in a corner of the screen. All this was written in assembly language for a cross-assembler that ran under GCOS, which is a machine that ran on top of some of the old GE machines, and produced paper tapes to be carried to the PDP-7. So they were literally coding it on one, producing paper tapes, walking it over to the PDP-7, and feeding that in. That's how they built that. Well, that started to make a whole entire operating system on the PDP-7 called Unix. Yes, it is spelled UNICS. That is how Unix is spelled. It stands for Uniplexed Information and Computing Service. This all started because of a need to port this video game. This literally is why this exists. Later on, a guy named Brian Kernighan, who also was a co-author of the famous book, The C Programming Language. Who's read that book, by the way? Of course you have. It's the Bible. With Dennis Ritchie, and also AWK, You guys know that, right? Kind of famous. He is the K in AWK. Brian Kernighan was the one who came up with the name Unix, UNICS. It was both a play on Multics because it's like Multics except simpler like it should have been, and also because it sounded like a eunuch, which he thought was funny. He felt it was like Multics, only castrated. That's not a joke, that's real. Nobody, and this is actually a real thing, no one seems to know when it became Unix with an X. Everyone's talked about it. Dennis Ritchie, Ken Thompson, all of them have talked about it, and they all agree that Brian Kernighan came up with the name, but no one knows why the CS became an X at all. Like, there's not even theories that any of them can agree on, even in the slightest. Which I think is amazing considering how important Unix is that no one knows why it's called that. So flash forward a little bit. We're skipping over a ton of history here because we want to get to the meat of the Linuxy stuff. On September 27th of 1983, on the use group net-.unix-wizards, that's right, we have this amazing post from the one and only Richard Stallman declaring, and I quote, "Free Unix!" Starting this Thanksgiving. This is literally the post that starts the entire thing. Starting this Thanksgiving, I'm going to write a complete Unix-compatible software system called GNU for GNU's not Unix, and give it away free to everyone who can use it. Contributions of time, money, and programs and equipment are greatly needed. To begin with, GNU will be a kernel plus, right? Because they ship the kernel really well. Plus all the utilities needed to write and run C programs, editor, shell, C compiler, blah, 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 blah. After this, we will add a text formatter, YAC, which is yet another compiler, an Empire game. Literally, Richard Stallman declared in his intentions to create this system that we better have an Empire game, a spreadsheet, and hundreds of other things. I like that clearly he didn't have an idea in mind of what else it would have, but it should have a lot. So hundreds. We hope to supply eventually everything useful that normally comes with a Unix system and anything else useful, including online and hard copy documentation. This is it. This is the post that was first put up there by Richard Stallman that started the free software revolution. GNU will be able to run Unix programs, but will not be identical to Unix. We will make all improvements that are convenient based on our experience with other operating systems. In particular, we plan to have longer file names. Actually, early Unix, really short file names. It's really similar to DOS in that way, which is amazing. A lot of people don't realize that. File version numbers, note, old Unix, no file version numbers. Things have changed a lot. A crash-proof file system, and when he says a crash-proof file system, that actually has two different meanings. The first of which was the old file systems on these old Unix systems just simply crashed a lot. And so when he says crash-proof, he means less buggy. File name completion, perhaps, and at this point he's just kind of throwing stuff out there. And he talks about Lisp a lot because a lot of people don't know this, but Richard Stallman was the guy behind Lisp. He was a Lisp guy for years. That's what he really did. Both C and Lisp will be available as system programming languages. We will have network software based on MIT's ChaosNet protocol, far superior to UUCP. We may also have something compatible with UUCP. Quick poll, anyone know what UUCP is? The older guys know. You in the back, my man. What is
Unix copy program?
Bingo, Unix to Unix copy protocol or program, depending on which book you're reading at the time. But literally, UUCP, for most people, ended up being a collection of applications for doing networking, for moving files around and whatnot.
It was specifically designed for modem to modem.
It was, yes, it was modem to modem initially. Yeah, it was all over. It was very cool, and Richard Stallman was not a fan. So he came up with this idea, right, for GNU. Why I must write GNU, and this is all still from that initial 1983 newsgroup posting. I consider the golden rule requires that if I like a program, I must share it with other people who like it. I cannot in good conscience sign a non-disclosure agreement or a software license agreement so that I can continue to use computers without violating my principles. I have decided to put together a sufficient body of free software so that I will be able to get along without any software that is not free. I mean, that's the standard Richard Stallman stance we've kind of come to know and love over the years. But this was the first time it was really publicly put out somewhere, and it was on the Unix Wizards news group. One computer manufacturer, this is interesting, has already offered to provide a machine, but we could use some more. One consequence you can expect if you donate machines is that GNU will run off them at an early date, because we'll have them. The machine had better be able to operate in a residential area and not required sophisticated cooling or power. I think that last sentence should be included in any request for donations nowadays by any distribution. I just think that's great. I mean, I know things were different back then, but I mean, how many times do you think I'm going to get a really awesome computer? Boy, I hope my residential computing power resources can handle that. It's just so neat. So let's flash forward a little bit to March of 1985. Do you guys remember Dr. Dobbs' journal? Yeah, it was the king of old computer programmer newspapers, right? Dr. Dobbs' journal was amazing. So in March of 85, side note, this is the first issue of Dr. Dobbs' journal. Dr. Dobbs' journal was originally titled Dr. Dobbs' Journal of Tiny Basic Calisthenics and Orthodontia. This is absolutely real, and it does have a naked guy on the front. Running light without overbite. The entire purpose for Dr. Dobbs' journal, and this is a real thing, to exist was to distribute something called Tiny Basic. That was the whole purpose of it existing, was people would come up with implementations of Tiny Basic. And the whole point of Tiny Basic was to create a basic interpreter that could fit in like between 2 and 4K. So something really tiny, so it would run identically on whatever mainframe, a PDP, anything else, and you could put it on any platform. And so they created Dr. Dobbs' journal just to distribute this in old school, here's the paper, go and sit down and type it out like a real man does. So that's the first version of Dr. Dobbs' journal. Well, in March of 85, Dr. Dobbs, after already having published many different luminaries like Steve Wozniak and others, published this also from Richard Stallman, where he starts talking about what we've already gained. And this is in the 2 years that have gone by since he announced it on the news group. He talks about how they've already got an Emacs text editor, and Lisp, which were Richard Stallman's 2 claims to fame at that point. But they had source level debugger, 35 utilities, an initial kernel exists, but many more features are needed to emulate Unix. That's heard. Yeah, they're still working on that one. That was 30 years ago. I don't know. Actually, I did at one point a roadmap based on how many bugs are left in herd before they can consider it like a 1.0 launch. And I think I came to the conclusion that it ships in 2070 something. I did a video on this where I actually showed the graph of it until it ships. I think it's like 2070 we'll see the herd 1.0 at the current rate. But anyway, we will use the free portable X Windows system as well, and they start talking about all this stuff. And this is the first time that we start to see kind of that free software manifesto from Richard Stallman. However, he did say to avoid, I like this, to avoid horrible confusion, please pronounce the G in the word GNU when it is the name of this project, which nowadays people actually argue still about this, but in order to avoid horrible confusion, say GNU. Or I just say GNU like I do, and then it's just you saying letters and no one can yell at you. And then he goes on to talk more about the golden rule. And what I think is interesting is nowadays when Richard Stallman talks, he doesn't talk as much about the golden rule when he talks about free software. But in those early posts, the phrase golden rule is everywhere. Really, like, it's kind of part of the first initial declaration of free software. It's very interesting. Interestingly, I refuse to break solidarity with other users in this way of not agreeing to share it. I cannot in good conscience sign a non-disclosure agreement, right? For years, I worked within the artificial intelligence lab at MIT to resist such tendencies and other inhospitalities. But eventually, they had gone too far. I could not remain in an institution where such things are done for me against my will, so that I can continue to use computers without dishonor. I love that. I feel like he's like a samurai at this point. I cannot use computers without dishonor. I have decided, I'm going to get yelled at for doing that. I've decided to put together a sufficient body of free software so that I will be able to get along without any software that's not free. I have resigned from the AI lab to deny MIT any legal excuse to prevent me from giving GNU away. I thought that was interesting. So in '85, or actually right before that, Stallman actually resigned so that he could keep working on this without anyone having any legal recourse to take GNU from him because he was working there at MIT.
Contract that was common at the time where anything he did
Yes.
became the property of where he was working.
That's exactly right. He signed a contract and he needed to leave if he wanted to keep working on it and keep it.
No.
He told his boss no. That's what a good programmer does. He says, boss, no, I'm going to do what's right. Well, let's flash forward. I'm skipping a whole lot of ridiculous stuff that happened over those 6 years. There's a lot of craziness. Now, Minix. Minix was an operating system developed predominantly by Andrew Tannenbaum, who is kind of an esteemed professor in the computer science field. He kind of created Minix to be a Unix-ish learning operating system for his students. Now, on August 25th of 1991, does anyone know what happened on that date?
Linus Torvalds posted to Comp OS Linux.
Bingo! This is Linus's first announcement that Linux was coming on. Hello, everybody out there using Minix. That's my Linus Torvalds impression. I'm doing a free operating system. Just a hobby, won't be big and professional like GNU. For 386, 486 AT clones. This has been brewing since April, and I'm steadily starting to get ready. I'd like any feedback on things people like or dislike in Minix, as my OS resembles it somewhat. Same physical layout of the file system. I used the same Minix file system back then, among other things. Actually, Linux was actually built inside Minix for the most part. It was a very funky system back then. I've currently ported Bash and GCC and things seem to work. This implies that I'll get something practical within a few months, and I'd like to know what features most people would want. Any suggestions are welcome, but I won't promise I'll implement them. Smiley face. P.S. Yes, it's free of any Minix code, and it has a multi-threaded file system. It is not portable, uses 386 task switching, etc., and it probably never will support anything other than AT hard disks, as that's all I have. Frowny face, Linus. And this is just a tidbit. That's what Linux used to be called. It was called Freaks. That was Linus's first initial name for Linux. It was a portmanteau of free, freak, and X. Smashed together, Freaks. Weird tidbit. Also, first release of the Linux kernel, Linux everything, had its own custom. Basically, these are the terms of service. This is the license. This is the full thing. Full source must be available and free. If not not within the distribution, then at least on asking for it. Copyright notices must be intact. You may not distribute this for a fee, not even handling costs. So his first license, he said, you cannot sell CDs with this on it. You cannot sell anything with this on it. You cannot even require that people pay for postage to get it. Like, he was adamant about it, which I think is fascinating because a lot of people don't realize Linux was not GPL. It was not GPL at all initially. It had some of the same kind of ideas, but he had his own thing. Also, in that announcement, he gave his apologies. This isn't yet the mother of all operating systems. Anyone who hoped for that will have to wait for the first real release. And even then, you might not want to change from Minix. This is a source release for those that are interested in seeing what Linux looks like. And it's not really supported yet. Anyone with questions or suggestions is encouraged to email me. I just like that he made apologies. This is the first main function. This is what the main function of Linux looked like on version 0.01. This is the whole thing. This is the main.c file and the main function. I just think it's cool to be able to go back and look at it. By the way, the main function doesn't look like this anymore. It looks quite a lot different. Some of the ideas are still there, though. Some of it is still fairly straightforward, but even those simple init functions, those have changed quite a lot over the years. What I really like is if you go through that first release of the Linux source code, the comments are fantastic. Lots of things like, this really is void, no error here. Lots of just random little tidbits, mostly notes to himself about, I don't like this code, this is ugly, and he just moves on. It's fantastic. So then some time goes by. In the spring of 1991, I say spring because there is some argument about what the exact date here is, Orest Zborowski implements the first socket layer on Linux. And why is this important? Because up until this point, we didn't have Unix domain sockets, which means we couldn't have an X server, which means we couldn't have X windows, which meant there was no GUI. Up until this point, Unix was 100% in your terminal. And thanks to Orest, we have Unix domain sockets, which it turns out was the first networking socket layer for Linux, period, came in spring of 91. Up until that point, didn't exist whatsoever. So if we use a GUI on Linux, we really have this guy to thank. He kind of made it possible, and no one talks about the famed Zborowski much. And I think that's sad. So I would like everyone really quickly to give an applause to Orest Zborowski. He did that. That's awesome for us. Anyway, flashing forward a little bit. January 13th, 1992, Linux 0.12 was released. This is remarkable for one key reason, actually multiple reasons, but the first of which is it's GPL'd now. Up until now, it was all under that proprietary license, and Linus eventually was like, you know what? It's time. It's time. The Linux copyright will change with this release. I've had a couple of requests to make it compatible with the copyleft of GNU, removing the "you may not distribute it for money" condition. I agree. I propose that the copyright be changed so it conforms to GNU, pending approval of the persons who have helped write code, which I thought was cool. Linus actually checked in with the other contributors before he did it. I think legally it was kind of debatable about whether he needed to or not. It's still a gray area, but he checked in, and I thought that was pretty rad. I assume this is not going to be a problem for anybody. If you have grievances, mail me. Otherwise, the GNU takes effect on the 1st of February. And as we now know, it did. However,
You don't get the gist of it.
yeah, if you don't know what GNU is, just go read it, geez. I just like that approach. And in 1.2, and .12, we now have some really, really cool new features, such as Linux now prints cute dots when loading. That was one of my favorite new features. Linus says in his own words, "Wow, run, don't walk to see this." Seriously, it should hopefully now load even on machines that never got off the ground before. But otherwise, the loading hasn't changed. Implemented by Drew. I was trying to look into it to see which Drew this was. I think there was 2 Drews back then that had some contributions to the Linux source code. So I do not know which Drew implemented the cute dots when loading. However, I would like to take this moment to give a round of applause to Drew for the cute dots when loading. Drew, if you're out there, get a hold of me so I can tell people what your last name was. Also, this was the first time we got things like symbolic links and virtual memory. For real, there was no virtual memory or symbolic links until that time. I mean, does anyone remember a time when they were using Linux without symbolic links? I don't know. I didn't came in after this, but that's crazy to me that didn't come until then. Note, this has been tested by Robert Bloom, who has a 2 megabyte machine, and it allows you to run GCC without much memory. However, I had to stop using it as my disk space was eaten up by the GCC beta. This is kind of an interesting point to remember that in these early days when they implemented virtual memory under Linux, they were working with machines with just a couple megabytes of RAM at the most, and they couldn't really build their features because they didn't have enough memory to do so. And yet they managed to pull it off just the same. And here we are in 2018, and our web browsers take a gig of RAM. All right. Around 1991 and 1992, depending on your definition of what a Linux distribution is when we first saw the actual first Linux distributions. In fact, in my opinion, the first one is HJLU's boot root. This is it. This is literally a boot disk and a root disk that was distributed on two 5¼ inch floppy disks by H.J. Liu. And it was called the boot root because a boot disk and a root disk. You put in the boot disk and it boots. And then when you're prompted to, you pull out the boot disk and you stick in your root disk. And what do you got? Well, about 10 minutes later, you got root. Literally, took about 10 minutes on an average 386 at that point to get to root. This was not an instant on, instant off machine. But this really was, those floppies were the first real Linux distribution we ever had. And it came with almost nothing. It came with just enough to copy more files over and build things, but that's it. And then people actually began working to pull together information on various news groups and the like to help people, show them how to bring over applications onto boot root. And this is what it was. It was like our modern day equivalent of Gentoo. Like here's nothing. Here's a boot, and now compile it and hope for the best. And then here's a manual. That's what our very first Linux distribution was. Now, a little later in that year, in January 29th of 92, oh, you okay, dude? He's okay. Andrew Tannenbaum posted this to CompOS Minix. Linux is obsolete. Minix is a microkernel-based system. The file system and memory management are separate processes running outside the kernel, and that's better in a lot of ways. He then went on to rant and rave about how Linux was poorly designed and obsolete, and everyone has agreed that this is not the way to do it. Linux is a monolithic style system. This is a giant step back into the 1970s. That is like taking an existing working C program and rewriting it in BASIC. Right? To me, writing a monolithic system in 1991 is a truly poor idea. Just for the record, as of about 1 year ago, there were two versions of Minix, one for the PC on 360K diskettes and one for the 286/386 on 1.2 megabyte. The PC version was outselling the 286/386 version, and we're talking PC, we're talking like, 8086s, right? We're talking, pre-286 systems. That was outselling the 386 version by 2 to 1. I don't have figures, but my guess is that the fraction of the 60 million existing PCs that are 386/486 machines as opposed to 8088s and such is small. Among students, it is even smaller. Making software free, but only for folks with enough money to buy first-class hardware is an interesting concept. That was a nice backhanded dig at Linus there. Of course, 5 years from now, that will be different. But 5 years from now, everyone will be running free GNU on their 200 MIPS 64 megabit SPARCstation 5s. I would like to point out that Andrew Tannenbaum nailed it. Because in 97, that's all I was using was my 64 meg SPARCstation 5s running GNU Herd. So way to go, Andrew Tannenbaum. Now, in February of 92, we get our first real Linux distribution. First real one. Does anyone know what it's called?
LSL?
You thinking SLS? No. Try again, one more time. No. MCC. The MCC stands for the Manchester Computing Center Interim Linux. This was February of 92. This was the very, very first one that shipped with something that was more than just a boot disk and a root disk. This actually had utilities on it, and basically most of the Linux software that had been built and compiled up to that point. And we're talking stuff that was pre-compiled and ready to go. This was a true Linux distribution that came out of the Manchester Computing Center, which was kind of cool. Now, things started happening rapidly here. February of 92, things kicked off in the Linux land. This is Windows 3.1. This happened in April of 1992. I put this here to kind of give everyone a feel of where the world was at when we were trying to get our first Linux distributions off the ground. We were here at Windows 3.1, and we were creating the competition to this. Then in May, just after that, we have SLS, Soft Landing Linux Systems, which has the best tagline ever, gentle touchdowns for DOS bailouts. I thought that was fantastic. Now, SLS, Soft Landing Linux Systems, a lot of times people kind of consider that to be one of the first true Linux distributions. For some reason, the Manchester Computing Interim Linux really kind of gets forgotten. It wasn't around all that long, but SLS took a lot from MCC as well. Now, very shortly thereafter, well, later that year, Yggdrasil, which was the first Linux distribution that shipped with X Windows pre-configured out of the box. So you could actually boot your system and type Start X, and boom, you have a GUI. Well, 10 minutes later, you have a GUI. It was still really slow back then.
24 floppies could be more than 10 minutes.
Well, yeah, 24 3.5-inch floppies is what this shipped on. 24! How awesome is that? I mean, that means your software is rad if it ships on 24 floppies. I've never made software that shipped on 24 floppies. That is a bucket list dream of mine. But Yggdrasil was the first distro that was supported by a company. Here in the United States, they formed a company around this distribution to support it, to build it, to sell discs of it in a box. I mean, that was awesome. I mean, you needed a big box because 24 floppies. But yeah, 1992, that was the first time we had a real distro, like a real one, with GUI and everything. And it came on discs that looked like a little bit like that. That was a slightly later version, but 3.5-inch floppy is a 3.5-inch floppy. I figured this picture worked. Could not find a picture or an image of those early first rev floppies to save my life. I tracked down all sorts of people that used Yggdrasil back in the day. Couldn't find anyone that had the very first version, but this is, I think, the third major release, which was about a year and a half later. Then Slackware came along. And Slackware was the first Linux distro that had staying power. In July of '93, we got version 1 of Slackware. And Slackware gets a lot of credit nowadays. I mean, because it's kind of viewed as the granddaddy, because it's been around for so long. It wasn't the first or the second. Arguably, it was the third, but more it was about the fourth. And it also shipped on a whole boatload of floppies. Shipping it on 24 3.5-inch floppies was just the cool kid thing to do back then for Linux. And then Debian came out. Look at that, right there. July of 17th, 93, Slackware 1. September 15th, boom, Debian 0.01. Again, who's running Debian right now? That shipped in 1993. How rad is that? Those still exist. Those are still around. How many years later is that, guys?
25.
You did math fast. It's 25 years later.
How many operating systems did these make the foundations for?
And exactly, how many operating systems exist because Debian and Slackware? And both Debian and Slackware influenced massive amounts of companies and distributions all over the place, and they still are around. It's awesome. And then this all happened before Linux was 1.0. It wasn't even 1.0 yet. It was so beta, it was ridiculous. Seriously, I mean, if you get a chance to play with pre-1.0 Linux, it's buggy. It's really buggy, guys. It showed promise, was highly functional, it did a ton, and it wasn't like it was the worst thing ever, but it was buggy. I mean, it was all being developed for free by not as many people as are working on it nowadays, and it took some time. But in 1994, we hit 1.0, and that was a big moment, not just technologically, but like psychologically for people. Things really ramped up at that point. Later on, very shortly later on, as in that same month, SUSE was formed. First lasting company around Linux, because, well, Yggdrasil isn't really kicking around anymore. But when SUSE first launched, their very first version was 3 of 94. That was their version number. That's not even a joke. They didn't have a version number for it. They just named it after the date, 3/94. And the first version of SUSE Linux was Slackware. It was exactly Slackware. It was Slackware in German. That's absolutely not a joke. That's exactly what it was. In fact, if you go look online, if you search for SUSE history order form, you can find a screenshot, and I meant to put it in here, but I'm going to mention it now because I forgot to. You can find an order form in German that allows you to order, well, not anymore probably, a version of this version that is, it literally says it's Slackware but in German. That was the first version of SUSE Linux. And later on in '94, things got a little weird and rocky. Do you guys know about Della Croce? I don't know how to say his name, but I feel like if I mispronounce it, it's fine because he's a jerk. So this guy, William R. Della Croce Jr., trademarks Linux in August 15th of 1994. Does anyone know what William Della Croce's relationship with Linux is? Does anyone know? None whatsoever. He just decided to trademark it. He then went around the world demanding every company that used the word Linux in their name or shipped Linux to pay him 10% royalties on whatever they earned. I can't remember what the technical term for that is, so I'm just going to call him a jerk. This actually was a big concern back then because who had the money to fight this? Right? Back then, companies were starting to form, but this was just after SUSE formed. And when this was SUSE forming, it was 3 people who were college students who were literally shipping German Slackware. That's not exactly a recipe for rolling in the dough, right? So no one had the money to fight this guy for a while. I should note that this did eventually get settled, so 10% of the Linux industry does not go to William R. Della Croce Jr. So we really lucked out. It was around, I want to say, 97, 98 when this got settled. And when it got settled, Linus was very, very happy. In November of '94, Red Hat commercial Linux. It was the first time we had a Red Hat Linux, and they were shipping it. And they actually put the word commercial in the title because they wanted people to feel like it was supported. So it's Red Hat Commercial Linux, and that's what made it different back then. They went through a few naming changes, and they eventually dropped that commercial thing. Now they added back in Enterprise, which I don't know is all that different. But anyway, in '94 we have Red Hat. And here's the thing. Red Hat and SUSE still exist. Still to this day. What year is it? Is it 2018? How many years ago was that? 24. You are so good. You. And here's where we're at this day. And I kind of did this little thing for a couple of reasons. Part of it is that there's certain elements to our history that people are kind of starting to forget at this point. We're this huge mega thing. Linux is absolutely everywhere. Half of every company has an enterprise Linux distribution. We've got, how many Linux distributions are there for like consumer desktops? Like a billion? Like, I mean, just on Distro Watch alone, it's like 200, something like that. It's absolutely off the wall. And all of them have things like live CDs and USB boots and all of these amazing fancy things. And sometimes we just forget where we came from. Sometimes we forget that we came from Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson just wanting to be able to play their game that wasn't even really a video game, but they didn't like any of the software. Sometimes we forget that Richard Stallman was just like, forget it. I'm gonna quit my job. I don't like it here anyway, and I want to make my own software. And we just forget those things, and we take for granted all of this stuff. And so I wanted to point some of this out, and also the guy that created our ability to have X Windows on Linux. Man, no one talks about that dude. What was his name? Bam, Sporowski. Awesome, right? And we don't talk about these sorts of people anymore. We don't talk about these heroes or these villains. I feel like there's villains in the Linux history world that we've long since forgotten. And nowadays, sure, it's fun to poke it like Microsoft because they're evil, but realistically, you look at people like this, and we've dealt with problems like this in the past. We've dealt with massive trademark problems in the past, and we've overcome it every single time. And so when I look at this, I kind of pared down this whole history from initially about 200 slides into just these slides to kind of remind me and everyone else that these awesome things happened, and we kind of kicked the butt of all these evil people along the way. And it makes me feel good. And the fact that these companies still exist is kind of weird. It's weird. Technology companies don't last that long. I mean, most of those old systems from the 60s and 70s, they didn't have as long of a shelf life as we've had on the Linux side of things. I mean, they lasted a while, and you can still find PDP-11s that technically are in use. I do not know why, other than they are aesthetically so pleasing. I'm gonna go back to that. Seriously, guys, we need to look at that some more. I forgot how many slides I did. There we are. Oh, I guess it's PDP 7, but still. Oh, I need to go back to that. Anyway, that's really all I've got today, everybody. I would encourage everyone to go out and check into some of this really wicked old school history, because there's a ton of stuff we didn't get to go through today. But there's some really weird, badass stuff in the Linux world that we just don't talk about enough. So that's all I got for today. Go forth, go yell at people, go tell people cool things. I don't know. Go on. Go. Good.